Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an absolute pleasure to be back in the Hunter. Spent a lot of time here to understand how the river has changed over the last several hundreds of years and to think about how we can use our knowledge of science and geomorphology in particular in river management. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Who in this room does not know what geomorphology is? Be brave, put your hand up. So geomorphology is the study of the processes that shape the Earth's surface. So when we're talking about river geomorphology, we're talking about how water interacts with sediment and vegetation to shape the structure and the function of rivers. And so I'm going to tell you a bit of a story of the geomorphology of the Hunter River, how it's changed over time, and I'm going to tell you the good news story about river recovery, so we can move beyond the doom and gloom and start to think about whether these river systems are recovering and how we can utilise or best use natural processes to try and enhance the ecological health of our river systems, and also how we can start to think about things like utilising those natural processes for flood mitigation. So let's start at the beginning. Okay, we know that Indigenous peoples have been on this land for tens of thousands of years, and how river systems have been fundamentally transformed, particularly post-colonisation. We think that the floodplains in the Hunter Valley were a more open forest association, and there was a relatively dense riparian corridor. What's fundamentally changed is the morphology or the structure of our rivers, and you can see the parish map in the top right-hand corner of this slide here, which shows what the Hunter River used to look like at about the time of European colonisation. It was a much more sinuous river, so very, very bendy, and it had a much smaller capacity channel. And those floodplains and those wetlands were engaged a lot more regularly. So many of these rivers had highly sinuous channels, and in the 1950s, these rivers were channelized. Big capacity channels were formed, and they were straightened. There's been a long history of tinkering, of management of the Hunter River system. And this is a very, very common set of circumstances up and down the coast and in many, many other rivers across Australia. So without going into too much detail, essentially in the Hunter River was transformed very soon after colonisation, and this was associated with things like the removal of all that messiness that we were talking about earlier, removal of riparian vegetation, removal of wood. So all of those resistance elements were being removed from these river systems, associated with trying to improve navigation and for flood mitigation. And this was particularly prevalent in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 60s, and particularly after the 1955 flood. However, the good news story is that river recovery has been occurring since about the 1980s, and we can detect a fundamental shift in the condition of the rivers, particularly in the Hunter, post about 1980. These were some of the geomorphic changes that were occurring early on, post-colonisation. So significant disturbance was creating things like channel incision and head cut retreat. What that means is the channel bed is lowered and you get head cuts that chew away at the river system, creating much larger channels, which enhances the erosive potential of river channels. So that leads to sediment contributions, which produce things like in-stream sediment slugs and floodplain sediment slugs. Also, channel straightening was very, very active. So concentration of flow in these big straight channels meant that they had a lot of energy and were a lot more erosive at that time. And so you end up with positive feedback mechanisms that create these erosive river systems. And that was very common and occurred, as I said, relatively soon after colonisation, and has taken many, many decades to manifest through these river systems. But it's interesting that there were some early warnings about the condition, particularly of the Hunter River system. And here's some quotes from an inquiry or from a report that was written in the late 1890s and in around 1902. And this is from Maiden. So this is over 120 years ago. And he states in there that one lays a special stress on the value of the river oak for purposes of bank protection, for the reason that it has for ages been the natural bank protector of these streams and has largely become adapted to its environment. He also says it ought to have been made penal to ring bark up to a certain distance from a watercourse or to cut down a river oak on any of the rivers, except under a special licence only to be obtained after due inquiry. He then comes to the conclusion that the remedy required to bring stream-back erosion under control is to re-establish dense woody vegetation to give continuous bank protection, and that this protection must extend completely over the bank, and in dangerous places such as river bends should extend inland from the top of the bank for at least half a chain. So this is 120 years ago. We're talking the same sort of language 120 years later in terms of river management. So as I said, river recovery has been happening since the 1980s. This is a good news story. And over the last few years, we've been trying to investigate what this river recovery looks like in geomorphic terms, in vegetative terms, and what that means for hydrology, so things like flood mitigation. So when we're talking about river recovery, in geomorphic terms, we're trying to identify a noticeable improvement in the physical structure of the river. So the types of landforms that are being created, that messiness that's in the river channels themselves. When we're talking about vegetative recovery, we're talking about a noticeable improvement in the quantity and the quality of vegetation that's growing both in the in-stream zone and in the riparian zone. And when you have geomorphic messiness or complexity, plus vegetation regrowing within your river channel and on your floodplain, you create roughness. And roughness is great for rivers. Roughness slows flood flows down, significantly reduces their velocity and reduces their erosive potential. So getting the roughness back in the river is absolutely fundamental if we're going to use natural processes for flood mitigation. And so when we see these processes occurring, we're talking about hydrological recovery. So a slowing and a lowering of major, moderate and also minor floods. And this is called natural flood management. So these are some of the things that we've seen. These are some of the changes, geomorphologically and vegetatively, that we've seen for many, many rivers in the Hunter Valley and elsewhere as well. We're seeing fundamental transitions in the geomorphic structure of the river. So you can see here for a couple of examples, for Wallumbye at Bulga, around Muswellbrook, and also just out the back here at Singleton, we're seeing changes in the geomorphic structure of the river, from things like homogeneous sand sheets through to beautiful pool and riffle sequences. These things called benches that act to contract channel capacity. So the geomorphic structure of the river has become more complex over time, and that adds roughness to the river channel. We've also seen a significant regreening of river systems up and down the coast, of which the Hunter Valley is just one example. So this phenomenon has been occurring since about the 1980s with better land management practices, with the advent of land care and so on, and the river systems have been recovering in these respects. So we are seeing this recovery, and that's producing roughness. And this roughness is starting to show some signals in terms of changing hydrology and contributing to flood mitigation. So sorry to put some graphs up, but we're going to get a little bit sciencey here and throw a few numbers in. But when we've got our geomorphic recovery, we've got our vegetative recovery, and we're seeing this increase in the roughness of the river channels and riparian zones, we can start to see some effects in terms of the way that floods travel through river channels. So here's some examples of some hydrographs. So you'll all be familiar with these if you watch, the BOM website and the Water New South Wales website during flood events. These are just graphs that show the rising and the waning of water levels during flood events of different magnitude. And what we've done is we've taken these hydrographs from the historical record and from the most recent or the last several decades of flood events. And what we're seeing is we're seeing river or floods, flood peaks are travelling, taking a lot longer to travel from point A to point B, and they're also slowing down. So we are seeing some effect in terms of flood mitigation using some of these natural recovery processes. So just by way of example, for the Hunter River, travelling from point A to point C, which is Singleton to Maitland, in 1971, that flood peak in 1971 took about 18 hours. An equivalent flood, which is the Pasha-Bolka storm in 2007, took about 28 hours. So that flood peak was a lot slower during the Pasha-Bolka storm. Similarly, we have other examples from Wallenby Brook where we're seeing significant slowing down of floodwaters. And when you slow floodwaters down, you slow down their erosive potential. So flood peak travel time has been extended. So travel time is taking longer. These floods are taking longer to progress through river systems. The flood peak speed is decreasing, but floods are not yet getting lower in terms of their water level. And there's a range of complex hydrological processes occurring in there that I can explain to anybody who is interested a little bit later on. So the good news story is that we are starting to see signals of natural flood management occurring within the Hunter Valley. So what do we do now? Okay, what's the next sort of phase in terms of trying to ensure that we value add on some of this recovery that's happening? How do we try and stay the course and keep the rage and make sure that we don't get despondent about the impacts of things like floods? I wanted to put in front of you the 2022 inquiry into the floods that occurred, particularly up on the Northern Rivers region. And if you haven't picked up this report, it's definitely something that you should get hold of and you should read from cover to cover. Had to dig right down into recommendation 20 and 27 to hear about anything associated with the environment, but I think these recommendations are absolutely fundamental. So instead of adopting them in principle by the state government, I would strongly recommend that we adopt them, not just in principle, but we implement them. And these are fantastic recommendations, and they really go to the heart of how we can consider rivers as living entities and how we can start to think about using natural processes as part of flood mitigation planning going forward. So recommendation 20 is to consider to use floodplains as assets, including letting watercourses largely flow naturally rather than implementing engineering barriers such as flood levees and mitigation schemes to stop floods. Obviously, reconsidering land use planning and development on floodplains, particularly relevant for places like the Hawkesbury in Western Sydney. And recommendation 27, specifically the need to develop an Indigenous-led cultural landscape restoration strategy for nature-based flood mitigation and adaptation, which would see large-scale native revegetation and wetland restoration. Fantastic, and I didn't write that. Okay, I wish I had. Fantastic recommendations that are there for everybody to see, and I think if we're smart, we will implement those because we're already some ways towards implementing these recommendations. My other 2 points are, well, what do we do now? Okay, we've got some recommendations, we're starting to see recovery, we're starting to see that this is having an impact in terms of hydrology and flood mitigation. So we need to continue to enhance recovery using these nature-based solutions. Of course, we need to work locally, but we need to dramatically upscale our efforts to the catchment scale. So while we're seeing signals of natural flood management emerging, we're going to have to upscale our efforts and work at the corridor and the catchment scale if we're going to have any effect on some of those major floods and to mitigate them to a significant degree. So we need to use all the roughness tools that we have in our toolbox. We need to increase bank and bench strength using ground cover, which is a fantastic ground stabiliser. We need to enhance in-stream and riparian roughness through the use of different types of vegetation or wood to slow flows down and to reduce their erosiveness. We need to lock up sediment at source and particularly lock up sediment in benches. We need to undertake weed management and replacement of vegetation to improve the biodiversity value of our riparian corridors, potentially considering the use of low-intensity cultural burning. Utilise the naturally occurring seed bank where we have that available to us. Improve the condition of floodplain wetlands and allow them to act as natural flood detention basins. That's what they used to be like prior to colonisation, and as part of flood mitigation or natural flood management, we will have to reconsider how we utilise floodplains as assets. And finally, flood mitigation and river recovery is a catchment scale cumulative exercise, but every single reach counts towards a corridor, and to upscale these efforts so that we can start to consider the role of natural processes in flood mitigation. So my key message is get the roughness back into the river. It's like good fibre in the gut, okay? Fibre in your gut equals a healthy gut. Roughness in the river and a messy river is a good river. They're my messages for today.